Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines with me, Ahmad Bostan, here live on British Muslim TV, Sky Channel 752. We're also online, www.britishmuslim.tv. We pray this program finds you well and in the best of health, inshallah. Now, those of you who watch our show regularly, and I certainly hope you do, will know the format by now. Every single week, we are honored, we are privileged to have every Friday night an inspirational guest joining us to talk about their life story, the ups, the downs, the struggles, the achievements, those things that haven't gone so right. And the aim is simple: to inspire all of you watching at home in various ways, shapes and forms, whether it's personal progression, professional progression. That is what we do here on Behind the Headlines, live exclusively on British Muslim TV. Remember, this is your show. We are here before you, live and interactive. So please do get in touch with us with any questions or comments you have. 01924 231 083 is a studio number where you can call in live, or you can, of course, get us on Twitter at British Muslim TV. We're on Facebook, British Muslim TV. We are wherever you are. So please make sure you get in touch tonight. Now, we are honoured and privileged this evening to be joined by one of the most acclaimed academics of our time, someone who is not afraid when it comes to speaking the truth, addressing controversial issues, and particularly issues of our time: Islamophobia, racial discrimination, the dynamics that we see in global politics. Someone who has very much specialized in this area for many, many years. Professor Nazia Kazi is an associate professor of anthropology at Stockton University. She is an acclaimed author of many books, including Islamophobia, Race and Global Politics, the second edition of which was published only this week. So hot off the press indeed, that second edition is. And she joins us now live from the United States of America. Assalamu alaikum, Professor Nazia Kazi. Thank you so much for joining us on British Muslim TV live this evening.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, before we start talking about your journey and your life, how are things where you are at the moment? Because I know there's been a huge amount of floods and hurricanes that we've seen documented in the media. How are you and your family, your colleagues, coping right now?
Yes, thank you for asking. I am in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia, New Jersey, and New York City were hit especially hard by this hurricane that actually, made landfall near New Orleans, and that is quite a distance away. Thankfully, I personally am fine, but we are seeing in real time the devastation of climate crises unfolding around us, while those in power, are very reluctant to move on this issue. Thank you for asking.
No, thank you very much for updating us, and we're happy to hear that you are well. And sadly, there are a number of challenges so far as the climate crisis is concerned. Just before we came on air today, I was reflecting with you in terms of here in the UK, we've had one of the coldest August months that I can certainly recall for many years. And then people say, what's climate change? And I think, in the less severe case, we see it here. In the more extreme cases, we see it right now in the United States and all around the world. And the climate crisis emergency is very much before us. But that brings me nicely on, Professor Kazi, to speak about your story. You've become one of the most acclaimed academics of our time. You are a prominent author, and you're somebody who speaks about those issues which people tend to stay away from, don't want to talk about, those taboos really that are out there, the discrimination, the barriers that exist. But let me ask you about your journey. Where did it all begin? Where did that passion for academia come from?
It's hard to answer that question because on the one hand, my family are from India. We are Muslims from India. So there is an experience of dispossession and marginalization that is sort of intrinsic to my family's very experience, especially, coming out of the ravages of British colonialism in the Indian subcontinent. So on the one hand, I was already sort of primed for having a critique of state power, which I think really guides so much of my own work on Islamophobia. But then, I think more obviously, I was a young person in the US living in the Chicagoland area when the September 11th attacks took place about 20 years ago. And in the aftermath of those attacks, we certainly saw a new intensified hostility towards not just Muslims in the US, but those thought to be Muslim. So that included Arab Christians, it included certainly Sikhs, and to an extent, Hindu Americans. This new kind of racism that took shape in the US happened at the same time that US militarism expanded. So the creation of this never-ending war on terror was happening when I was also observing this new form of American Islamophobia and racism. And for me, it became very compelling to think about the connections between both of those, sort of the hostility and bigotry experienced by brown people in the US alongside US foreign policy.
Mm. And how was your quest finding a space in that arena at the time? What became, sadly, not just the United States and the UK and around the world, a huge surge of Islamophobia, anti-Muslim sentiment that came out of a truly barbaric, horrific terrorist attack that every Muslim, of course, most certainly condemns. How did you find your experience going out there and trying to seize that narrative?
It's very challenging when you live at the heart of empire. And I believe that the US is an empire, perhaps an empire in decline, and we can think about that. I think it's very hard when you live at the heart of empire to speak earnestly about it. So in the US, there is a large and growing space for Muslim Americans to articulate their love for the United States. There is a lot of space for Muslims to argue for inclusion or the right to build mosques or the right to, observe Ramadan and have workplace observances for their religious practices. But there is less space, and there is far less space for people of color in the US to speak earnestly and critically about American policy, economic policy, foreign policy, military policy. This became very clear to me after September 11th, 2001, when church groups were sending gift baskets to their local mosques. And even George W. Bush himself, one of America's most notorious Islamophobes, said, take your Muslim neighbors shopping, be kind to them, etc. There was this room for the inclusion of Muslims, but only those Muslims who were uncritical of the US's role on a global stage. Once you said something about the US's invasion of Afghanistan, or 2 years later, something about the US invasion of Iraq, or the creation of a military torture prison for Muslims only at Guantanamo Bay, once you started talking about these policies and these practices, you were no longer allowed to be legitimate as a Muslim American.
And how did you deal with that, both on a personal and a professional level? Were there moments where you just said, do you know what, I should just get a normal day job and try my best to fit in as best I can?
Well, I think I was pushed by forces larger than myself. I think once one begins to really confront the realities of American power, there's no turning away from it. And so regardless of whether I embarked on my profession as an academic and an anthropologist and a social scientist or not, I would have been vocal and critical of the practices of US empire. I mean, here in the US, we are surrounded by militarism in a way that I think many people around the world would find unusual. If you go to a football game, quite often the Air Force will have a very expensive display of their state-of-the-art equipment. If you go to the movies, a lot of Hollywood films are sponsored, funded, and reviewed by the Pentagon, right? By the Department of Defense. So even our entertainment is vetted and produced by the military-industrial complex. So it would be very hard for me to shut up, quite frankly, about the realities of American military might, just because of how abundantly clear it is to me and how ever present it is in my lived reality.
And when you started that journey, when you started your academic journey, did you envisage yourself as an academic? Because with the views you have and the change you want to see in the world, you could have gone into politics, you could have gone into journalism. Why academia?
Well, the American political system is filled with people who are quite beholden to some of the most powerful lobbying interests in the US, whether that is the military industry, whether that is tobacco, pharmaceuticals. We have seen a lot of earnest, well-intentioned people enter American politics and be pulled ever further toward the center and eventually the right. And I think a lot of people in the US who have studied and thought soberly about this history, about the American political system, prefer to be involved instead in sort of mass movements of organized people, who are educated and informed, who are not trying to work within a corrupt two-party system, but instead work on behalf of working people in the US for dignity and justice.
Mm. Finally, before the break, Professor Nazia Kazi, breaking through that gap, going into that mass movement, did you find, especially in your early days, was it making a difference, or did you think to yourself, I wish the political system was more inclusive, the press agencies were more inclusive?
Well, I don't draw much of a line between American press agencies and the political system. I mean, if you were to look at who it is that, for instance, CNN brings in to comment about US military policy, these are often former military officials. These are defense executives. So there's sort of this direct line between the US media and the military industrial complex that often does not get talked about and often tries very hard to obscure itself behind the facade of sort of a free press, as they will put it. But it's anything but. And so in the US, you often have to turn to the more sort of investigative journalists who are independent, who refuse to accept funding from huge foundations that may shape their narrative, or from corporate donors. And you have to be, very thoughtful as you make these decisions as a consumer of news media. So I think, there are these structures that sort of present themselves as potentially liberatory. The American political system really acts as though, and we are taught in our civics classes growing up, as though we have the most free system of democracy, where you get to vote and exercise choice. And when you think about it more and more,
we are going to go to a break. We'll be back right after this in discussion with Professor Nazia Kazi. Join us after this. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Behind the Headlines live on British Muslim TV. We're in a fascinating conversation interview with Professor Nazia Kazi, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Stockton University and acclaimed author of many books, including Islamophobia, Race and Global Politics, the second edition of which has come out only this week. And we were in conversation with Professor Kazi about how the terrible atrocities of 9/11 actually motivated her to really take her place in the academic space, in the space of anthropology and social sciences, in order to make a difference. And Professor Kazi was speaking about the restrictions and the limitations that she believes exists currently in the United States so far as political engagement, at least that party political engagement, and indeed engagement on the part of the press, and how independent journalists are the ray of hope there in terms of driving a narrative that is not influenced by any corporate or other forms of interest. Professor Kazi, welcome back to the show. I just want to explore a topic with you that you referred to earlier about the military. There's some people out there who would say nobody wants war, war's a sad failure of diplomacy, but sometimes war is necessary. You need to have strong military out there. There's so many countries nowadays that have nuclear weapons. They never use them, but nobody wants to be the first to let them go. Do you think there is any space there for military?
Well, it depends on the nation you're speaking about. I mean, when we're talking about the US, it is a country with a military budget of somewhat $800 billion that expands every year. that is not including the private military forces that don't count in that budget. The US military has some 800 military bases around the world in other countries. It's notable that other countries do not have military bases on US soil. So if you're talking about the army, the military might of an imperialist country like the US, then that question gets answered very differently. I mean, if we think about some of the dangerous or repressive nations that exist around the world, quite often we find that they are allied with the United States. Sometimes their leaders are put into power by the United States, that in elections in countries around the world are often meddled in by the US intelligence apparatus to determine the outcome of those elections so that it favors the elite, right? The corporate classes in the United States. I mean, anyone who's studied the history of, for instance, the United Fruit Company knows this history deeply. Right? Or people who are tracing the lithium market these days can see that today. So when we're talking about military power, we have to be very clear, like for what purpose are military incursions made? Mm-hmm. And obviously the US presented itself as invading Iraq in 2003 for laughable reasons, such as Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction, or the desire to bring democracy to the country. Of course, anyone who knew their history, they would know that in the past, the US had actually given chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein, or that the US had actually interfered in Iraqi processes of democracy. For instance, when the US saw to it that Abdul Karim Qasim was overthrown and he was angling for a democratic Iraq. So these are the questions that we have to be very nuanced about. We can't really fall back on these simplistic ideas of sometimes war happens and it's unjust. And certainly we can say those things are very true, but we can think about them on a more nuanced and historically contextual level to allow ourselves more and greater room for critique.
And of course, that involvement of the United States, United Kingdom, and many other countries is now deeply under the microscope, especially when we're looking at what's happening in the nation of Afghanistan, hugely on the news screens right now, and the way in which Ashraf Ghani fled from the country. And we'll talk about that perhaps later on in the program. But let me ask you about the war in Iraq. 2003, Professor Kazi, over 1 million people went to the streets of Britain and protested against the war in Iraq. And there were many other protests around the world, including in the United States. What would you say to those people who say, well, there is a role, of course, for academia. There's a role to right and mass movements. But how do you get involved to stop things like that from happening? Isn't it about political reform? Isn't it about making sure that the space around that political table is more inclusive?
Well, you know, if we look at American history, which is where we can take most of our cues from, let's be clear that most of the movements toward bettering the world, whether it's domestically within the US or with regard to US foreign policy, were usually driven by concerted, organized movements of people around the world who forced those in seats of power to be accountable. It was never done sort of voluntarily by those in elected office to sort of enact things that were, for instance, we're looking at, you know, the housing crisis in the US in the midst of the economic crises brought about by COVID. It has been organizations, tenants' unions, tenants' rights organizations that have forced elected officials to reconsider eviction moratoria and housing policy in the US. They didn't volunteer to do that, right? So while there is an important role for the people who write the laws and policymakers, what American history has shown time and time again is that it is organized, angry masses of people forcing those in seats of power to sort of do the right thing. I mean, and this is a history that usually doesn't make itself known in the US. If you were to think, for instance, about most labor laws, for instance, the 8-hour workday, and how that came into practice, it was by, again, organizers who got together workers, and there was massive waves of direct action that forced those in seats of power to consider their demands. And until we're clear on that history, we will keep seeing people who structure their lives around getting a seat at that table, ignoring the realities that quite often that table does not have room for people with good intentions to take a seat.
And let's explore that a bit more if we may. So going back to your journey, you saw the huge amount of issues that came out of the 9/11 attacks. Where did you go from there, Professor Kazi? How did you map out your journey from there?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the September 11th attacks made a number of things clear about America. It certainly made clear America's sort of deep racism, right, as it surfaced, not just with regard to Muslims and those thought to be Muslim, but with migrants from Latin America, certainly with Black folks and Indigenous folks. But I think, the other thing that 9/11 made clear was the coziness of the two-party system in the US. I mean, Democrats were eager not just to sign on to, but quite often to be architects of war on terror policy. So for instance, the Iraq invasion in 2003 might not have been possible were it not for key actions taken by Joe Biden himself. And so what 9/11 did was it made clear that the two-party system is actually quite in agreement, is typically quite allied when it comes to matters of empire, when it comes to questions of what it is the US does on a global stage. And for me, this became sort of an obsession, right? Not just studying, but revealing the realities of this bipartisan consensus that exists in the US.
And how did you go about doing that work? Did you find a space? Were there people willing to fund you to do that kind of work, to engage in the teaching of that type of study?
Well, one distinct turn my work took, as I'm an anthropologist, was an ethnographic study that I conducted with some of America's sort of most elite Muslim American organizations. And I became very interested in thinking about why it was that the discourse on Islamophobia in the US took the shape that it did. Why you had so many people talking about, the significance of hijab, or repeating this phrase, Islam is a religion of peace, while you had very little in the way of US Muslims talking about what was happening at Guantanamo Bay and other carceral facilities in the US and around the world. Why you had so few willing to talk about the, economic exploitation of the Muslim majority world by the US. Why, in other words, the mainstream conversation on Islamophobia in America took this sort of attitudinal approach, this approach that argued, maybe if Americans just understand Muslims better, Islamophobia will crumble. Instead of thinking about the very real, very systemic, and very historical bases of American racism, empire, and Islamophobia.
But there will be some who say, well, surely it's because no country is perfect, no country's policies are perfect, but maybe American Muslims are very proud to be so. And yes, they understand the issues. They understand the way in which the war on terror has disproportionately felt as though it's affected Muslims more than anyone else. But overall, they're quite happy with their lot and they feel that they've got what they need for their families and their communities.
It really depends on which Muslim Americans we're talking to. I think one of the things Muslim Americans will often say is Muslims are diverse in the US. And I think that misses the point, which is not just that Muslim Americans are diverse, but that Muslim Americans are ruptured, violently ruptured. There are those who after September 11th were rounded up and detained, imprisoned without charge. These were immigrants. These were working class Muslim immigrants. These were not the people who go to the very expensive summer conventions that are held for Muslim Americans. And they didn't get to write the op-eds that appeared in the New York Times explaining, the significance of Muslims in the US. So when you think about Muslims in the US, we have to be real. The material needs and interests of Muslim Americans couldn't be more divergent. And so I always underscore the fact in my work that, when we're talking about Islamophobia, we might be better served by talking about Islamophobias, that the Islamophobia experienced by working class Muslim Americans, by Black Muslims, by undocumented immigrants is vastly different than that of, perhaps a sort of college educated person who went on to get their MBA and then go get a job as a consultant at McKinsey.
We are in conversation with Professor Nazia Kazi, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Stockton University. A very interesting discussion on, in fact, the nuances that we have within the Muslim community. That when we talk about the media and the media portraying an image of Muslims in certain sections of it, we can't just talk about that media which is mainstream. We can't just talk about mainstream communities. We need to be talking within our own Muslim community and thinking, well, actually, who is telling the story? Who is shaping the narrative? Who is here saying what people are going through? Are those people Muslims or not? Those who have had it difficult in life, have had issues, have had grievances, are they given a platform to speak? Really interesting discussion. We'll be back right after this break. Keep it behind the headlines. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Behind the Headlines here on British Muslim TV, live and interactive with you tonight. So if you do have a question or a comment, please do get in touch. 01924 231 083 is a studio phone number at British Muslim TV on Twitter. We're also British Muslim TV on Facebook, and we're in conversation with Professor Nazia Kazi, one of the most eminent academics of our time, someone who has spoken extensively and worked extensively on issues of Islamophobia, race and global politics. And we left Professor Kazi having made a very interesting point around who's got the mic, who is able to speak. Are we talking about the full diversity of the Muslim community when we see lovely written columns in newspapers, or we see these Muslim expo events that take place? Are we seeing all sections of the Muslim community? And Professor Kazi, is it a fault of us as a Muslim community? Have we failed as a community to engage all of our diversity in the pursuit of talking about, well, it's somebody else's problem, someone else is not bringing Muslims forward? Are we failing as a community? Have university-educated, college-educated Muslims, like ourselves possibly, dominated the narrative and the microphone for too long?
This is a terrific question, and it really is a central preoccupation in my own work, and I think the only thing I would do is probably problematize that question itself that frames it as a community, because I really struggle with wondering if we can speak of Muslims in the US, and I'm not sure if this could be said in the UK too, as a unified community, that actually with the drastic rifts in class interests, what we see are Muslim American communities that are scattered and that have completely different interests and motivations. So I remain very interested in these questions. And this surfaces around political engagement as well. I'm reminded of how Muslim Americans have been really fragmented in profound ways, I would say, around the issue of Israel's colonial occupation of Palestine. I mean, the fact that there are prominent Muslim American spokespeople who have been recruited by Israel to go visit Israel and come back to the US and give speeches and write op-eds that portray Israel favorably or downplay what they call the conflict, I think, is really interesting, especially given the response to that from those in Muslim and non-Muslim American spaces who feel very strongly about the settler colonial violence perpetrated by Israel. I mean, this simply reveals the divergent political interests that exist in Muslim America. So to speak of us as a unified community, I think sometimes obscures more than it reveals.
When we talk about Islamophobia, because I know this has been a key focus of your work and your study, have you found that if we are to run with the fact, and I totally understand where you're coming from, that we as a Muslim community are not necessarily a community as such, in the sense that we're all uniformed in the same way or think in the same way or have the same life experiences? Do you find that Islamophobia, anti-Muslim attacks, racism, discrimination, do they affect one section of the community more than they do another? What's been your understanding and work on that?
This is such a good question, and it's a reminder that we have to be very nuanced when we define this term, Islamophobia. Right? Like, do we think Islamophobia is bigoted attacks on people who are Muslim or thought to be Muslim? Or do we perhaps think that one of the most Islamophobic events of the century was the US invasion of Iraq, right? I mean, how we define Islamophobia will then shape our answer of where we see Islamophobia. And I tend to move away from the sort of attitudinal definition of Islamophobia, that definition that sees it as, acts of bigotry, acts of hate crimes, and instead connect acts of bigotry and hate crimes to those perpetrated by the state. So for instance, a lot of people don't know, and many people in Muslim America fondly remember the presidency of Barack Obama, but it was Obama who came up with a system of legally classifying adult Muslim men as enemy combatants. In other words, Muslim men who were killed by American drones under the Obama administration didn't count as civilians. They automatically counted as enemy terrorist targets. I mean, what could be more Islamophobic than that? And whether or not Obama spoke very kindly and charismatically at his iftar dinner at the White House seems kind of irrelevant in that moment, right? So once we allow ourselves to develop a politics of substance over a politics of form, once we allow ourselves to look past acts of political pageantry, then we can begin to have a more sophisticated definition of Islamophobia and an understanding of what Islamophobia actually looks like.
And the various forms of Islamophobia are interesting, aren't they? We're here today talking about your life and your story, and alhamdulillah, you're an accomplished academic, you're a prominent academic, you're also an author. Your experience of Islamophobia will be different to perhaps the experience of a Muslim working in another walk of life, in another path of life. Do we understand the various nuances? Are there people out there who might have been successful in life who feel they haven't been the victim of Islamophobia? Actually, when they think about it, there has been Islamophobia that's held them back in some way.
Absolutely. And when you raise this question of the different kinds of Islamophobia, we have to also think very carefully about sort of gendered Islamophobia and how the experiences of perhaps, women might look really different. I mean, right now, as the US, quote unquote, withdraws from Afghanistan, which we can problematize whether we can accurately characterize it as a withdrawal or not, one of these justifications for US involvement in Afghanistan to begin with was that the women needed to be liberated. I mean, this is that kind of gendered Islamophobia that we see so prominently in the US on display. And, of course, there's this historical context that is just radically absent here, because what isn't being said is that the repression of women in Afghanistan was funded by CIA dollars during the Cold War. I mean, a lot of Americans, a lot of people around the world don't, for instance, know that Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, an Afghani warlord, was given ample amounts of support and funding from the US as he advocated for throwing acid in the faces of women who didn't wear a veil. So what do we make of the repression of, quote unquote, repression of Muslim women once we have this kind of historical context? And that's a much more interesting conversation, I think, to have than to think about Islamophobia as some kind of monolith that falls down upon global Muslims uniformly.
And what's been the journey or the way in which Islamophobia has changed in your view since the attacks of 9/11, the invasion of Afghanistan, the Iraq War in 2003, we had the atrocities of 7/7 in 2005 here in this country. How has this all had an impact on Islamophobia in the lives of ordinary British Muslims, American Muslims?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we cannot underestimate how the response to 9/11 really transformed the world in key ways and sometimes in surprising ways. I mean, most obviously, it gave powerful countries the right to wage sort of unlimited war. And we have to talk about that both as it takes shape around the world, but also domestically. I mean, American society has become so militarized in the years since September 11th, 2001. I mean, you will see counterterrorism forces. These are forces that were ostensibly developed to fight against Muslim terrorists. These forces are used against Native Americans who are protesting to protect their water, right? To protect their water from being contaminated by oil and gas pipelines. So I think there's such a profound conversation to be had about how quote unquote Islamophobia has transformed life, not just for Muslims in the US, but for people around the world. I mean, the US-Mexico border has been militarized and policed and turned into this fortress because Americans are afraid of a terrorist takeover through the US-Mexico border. And what has that meant? Well, that has meant increasing brutalization of people in Latin America who are trying to come to the US as migrants. Why are they trying to come to the US as migrants? Well, that answer is because the US has written economic and military policy in Latin America in ways that have plunged countless people into abject poverty and desperation. And that's why they're trying to cross that border. So the question of Islamophobia is so much broader than the experiences of Muslims specifically, right? We are talking about structures of power that exist sort of around the world. I mean, one of the things people don't talk about is how 9/11 itself was, we can call it sort of an economic event. In the immediate aftermath of September 11th, 2001, George W. Bush was able to rewrite the tax code in ways that benefited the ultra wealthy. He was able to pass an economic stimulus bill that protected America's most elite corporate executives, including airline executives, that after September 11th, 2001, when the wealthiest Americans were pulling their money out of the stock market, ordinary Americans were told that buying stocks was a patriotic thing to do. I mean, we must understand Islamophobia in these larger contexts beyond a narrow focus on the experiences of Muslims. Otherwise, we sort of miss a very important big picture that is crucial for making sense of 9/11.
But while there will be certain elements of the political spectrum who will always seize the opportunity to introduce Islamophobic or anti-Muslim policy, when you talk about Afghanistan, and of course there's a lot to be said about it, especially given recent events, it was certainly argued at the time that the United States faced an imminent threat by way of terrorism, extremism, radicalization taking place in Afghanistan, and therefore that was said to be the reason why the US needed to go in order to target terrorists, extremists, or radicals that would actually pose a threat to the national security of the United States and to the civilians in the United States. We're in conversation with Professor Nazia Kazi, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Stockton University, talking to us about the way in which Islamophobia, racial discrimination, discrimination of all forms has sadly become far worse over the years, and the factors that contribute towards that, including, Professor Kazi has just argued, around the way in which conversations are restricted. And we've had that conversation here in the UK most recently as well. The former leader of the Labour Party, for example, Jeremy Corbyn, advocating a more diverse history curriculum. The fact that the history curriculum that's now taught in our schools does not reflect the diversity of Britain as a nation. We'd love to hear your views as well, dear viewers, so please do get in touch with us. Let us know what you think. Maybe you have a question for Professor Nazia Kazi. We'd love to hear from you. Our studio number live is 01924 231 083. You can also get in touch with us on Twitter at British Muslim TV, and we're British Muslim TV on Facebook. So please do join the discussion. We'd love to hear from you. We're back right after this break. Stay tuned to Behind the Headlines. Much more after this. Dear viewers, assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Would You Believe It?
Well, I mean, the very obvious response to that would be, what about the fact of Saudi Arabia's very close alliance with the United States and the number of attackers who were of Saudi origin? Now, of course, this falls out of conversation in the US because quite often people don't want to talk about the United States' two most strategic allies in the so-called Middle East, which are, of course, Israel and Saudi Arabia. And both are deeply repressive states. And Saudi Arabia is not repressive because of its own doing necessarily. It's that the US has orchestrated and promoted that repression because it serves the interests of both the military industrial complex and the desire to build military bases in Saudi Arabia, and the interests of the oil and gas industry, right? So there's context to be had here that makes it a little bit problematic to assume that Afghanistan was invaded because of some kind of threat it posed to the United States. Indeed, when the Taliban offered to surrender shortly after the US invasion of Afghanistan, the US denied that surrender and continued waging this war that is, just ending now in its 20th year. So there is some nuance to be added to the conversation, I believe, about, who poses a threat to the US and who doesn't.
And this goes back to the argument that has been made frequently, the critique that is made of not only US, but also British foreign policy, that when do we as a country decide whether we are to become militarily engaged in particular areas, and the idea and the reality that there are a number of atrocities taking place around the world, and you don't see Britain or the United States of America taking a firm approach when they should be, whether it's the Rohingya, people in Kashmir, etc. And that discussion is a very interesting one that I think is certainly being had here in Britain as well as in the United States, Professor Kazi. How have people as a whole reacted to the work that you've done? You're clearly someone who teaches, you're a lecturer. Do you find that there has been a greater level of interest, not only on the part of Muslims, but various young people from minority ethnic backgrounds who are saying, yeah, I want to learn more about this subject as well. I want to have that voice and that space to say what I think.
Yeah, I mean, I measure my success based on my work in the classroom with undergraduate students. And one of the things I've found to be very surprising and exciting is the enthusiasm that young learners bring to learning a more complex version of the story than what is typically offered to us. And I'll give you an example. In the US, we have a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, especially sort of on the right, on the political spectrum on the right, as was most keenly embodied by Donald Trump's planned construction of the border wall at US-Mexico border. And the liberal response to right-wing xenophobia is typically, the US ought to welcome immigrants, that America is a land of immigrants. And I will say that if this is where the mainstream conversation ends, we are never going to get people who are curious or thoughtful about, what's happening in the world. What I find really exciting about this conversation on migration is the reaction you get from young learners when you say, well, why are migrants coming to the US, especially, for instance, from Central and South America? Because then you can push past this liberal conservative conversation, which is actually quite narrow, that doesn't hold the US to account for its policy. There have been decades of what we call dirty wars in Latin America, where U.S. toppled national movements, democratic movements, and put into place sort of right-wing dictatorships that led directly to migration to the U.S. Most Americans do not know, for instance, about the School of the Americas, which existed under that name in Fort Bennings, Georgia. And it was basically a military school that imported people from Latin America, taught them repression, torture, how to repress protests, etc., and then sent them back to Latin America. Now, what I found really successful in the classroom is when you bring this history and context into the conversation, young learners really want to critically think about these topics. But if you limit the conversation to, should we let migrants in? Yes or no? Are they good for America or not? That's just a conversation they're frankly tired of having. So I like to push past that and offer an earnest, sort of more material approach to thinking about the realities of our world. And then you find that actually, particularly young Americans, are really excited to have this conversation.
We're going to talk a bit more about the issues of Islamophobia, race and discrimination. Professor Kazi, you referred to it, or him, briefly in the segment just before the break, but I want to explore this a bit further. President Donald J. Trump, now former President Donald J. Trump, where did he come from? Was he a product of the environment of racism and Islamophobia developing in the United States of America? Because he came as somewhat of a shock to many watching in Britain and around the world.
Right. I mean, I think, you know, when we consider what happened in the 2016 presidential election, there are roots to Donald Trump's political career. Most notably, he came to power or political prominence in a certain way by casting doubt upon the citizenship status of Barack Obama. But even before that, you know, Donald J. Trump had taken out decades before a full-page ad in the New York Times calling for the execution of these young Black children who had been falsely accused of murder. They used to be referred to as the Central Park Five. So he always leaned upon American racism to propel his political career. So that's really crucial. I mean, we can't forget that. But we also have to remember that the person he ran against, Hillary Clinton in 2016, was vastly unpopular for a number of reasons. I mean, Hillary Clinton had also voted for the creation of a US-Mexico border wall well before Donald Trump was even involved in politics. She had been a vicious expander of US militarism in the so-called Muslim world, that she had really overseen some very gnarly policy that alienated working class Americans. And so a lot of people who came out to support Donald Trump sort of did it as an angry rebuke to the Democratic Party's turn to the right.
And when you look at the rise of not just Donald Trump, but the politics that propelled him, the politics that brought him to where he was, what do you think that is? Is that from a place of political opportunism? Because there were a number of small incidents many years ago, many decades ago, in terms of Donald Trump's life, where he was a member of a number of minor parties and tried to take a bit of a liberal approach and didn't really make much of a mark from it. Was it political opportunism, or is this a case of genuine belief in the type of far-right politics that are often associated with the likes of Trump?
You know, I think there's actually a clip of Donald Trump, maybe from the 80s, where he says, you know, if I ever ran for president, I'd do it as a Republican. Republicans are some of the dumbest Americans, or something like that. I just astonishing that the fact that that exists, the record of that exists, and he still did really well with Republican voters, you know? So this question of opportunism, I think certainly, but I think we should also be clear that the same can be said about many of the American politicians who reach that level. I mean, most clearly we can see that with the current vice president of the United States, who has very directly leaned upon her biracial identity as a Black woman, you know, and an Indian woman, to sort of gloss over the really racist practices she enacted as district attorney of San Francisco and as a senator in the United States. I mean, so this question of opportunism, we can't just save it for Donald Trump, or else we're going to end up with a better version of Donald Trump in 2024, someone who behaves better on Twitter, but still is right-wing, you know, in the same ways, and is still racist in the same ways. So I think this question of opportunism needs to be posed to all of those who hold seats of power in the US, because it reveals something that is much larger than sort of what I call the Trump syndrome. This tendency in American politics to blame Trump as this singularly bad figure, instead of seeing the continuities between him, those who came before him, and those who come after him.
So where is the space going to be created to create a society where Islamophobia, racism, and discrimination not necessarily become a thing of the past, but are significantly less than what they are now? How can you get that space created within the current political environment? Is the hope of the United States Ilhan Omar, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and Bernie Sanders, a number of these quote-unquote internationally considered left-wing politicians that are there now? Do they hold the keys of hope in your mind to changing things?
Well, I think if we were to take a more global approach, if you were to actually look at the policies and practices of Bernie Sanders or AOC or Ilhan Omar, they would probably be closer to the center or center left in most countries, but that passes for far left in the United States because our political system is so far to the right. As to where these spaces exist, I'm happy to tell you these spaces exist in the US. I mean, it was just a couple months ago when 7,000 or 8,000 people marched through Philadelphia in opposition to Israeli violence, in Sheikh Jarrah. And so these spaces exist. If you had seen the uprisings I witnessed in Philadelphia last summer after the murder of George Floyd, it was remarkable. If you were to see the students I teach who went out in full force against Donald Trump's Muslim ban when that was enacted in early 2017, you'd see that these spaces exist, that every major city in the US has tenants unions, that places where pipelines are proposed to be built have indigenous-led movements of what are called water protectors who want to stand against the Biden administration's policy of allowing gas and oil pipelines to take treaty protected land from Native people, that these movements exist and they are growing. And I'm so excited to see in my own classroom and my work with younger Americans that they are frankly fed up with the political oligarchy in the US that exists, that allows these forces of capital and militarism to flourish. And so it is there that I really put my faith, right, in labor movements, in environmental movements, in anti-war, anti-imperialist movements in the US that pretty much 100% of the time fall outside of the formal political system and push the formal political system to do what's right.
Really appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you.
Let us know your views, dear viewers, on everything we've discussed tonight and the importance of widening that political space. Where are you active and you feel as though you're making a difference? We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your story on this program. So please do get in touch with us here at British Muslim TV on Twitter, British Muslim TV on Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. That has been our show for this evening. Inshallah, we'll be back next week. Same time, same place. Until then, remember us and each other in your du'as. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.